Hello everyone. Today we will be talking about ethics in the Indian tradition, and this is the culminating section of the entire course. In fact, ethics in the Indian tradition itself is a subject of inquiry, is an exhaustive subject of inquiry, and there is a lot of details over there. However, a course on ethics, especially sourced in India, cannot do justice to its name if it doesn't talk about ethics in Indian tradition. So here I make no claim of giving you an exhaustive introduction, but a very brief, perhaps window view of what ethics in the Indian tradition has been. This is something that many of you who are students from India will be able to connect with their lived experience, the terminologies they have come across in their families with ethics in Indian tradition. So this itself is quite a huge enterprise, and my aim here is to give you a brief overview and to know some concepts, to know some theories that you have to, not even theories but just concepts and notions, to prepare you to explore this field further if you wish to do so. So we are typically looking at the classical Indian thought. Now Indian as a category can be enormous, and it would mean ancient, medieval, modern India. There have been India has been a land of thinkers, so there have been a lot of thinkers, and every thinker has a significant section spent on ethical theories. So the source text that I would recommend for you all, a very simple introductory text, is Kedarnath Tiwari's Classical Indian Thought. So Tiwari ji has written a wonderful introductory book trying to consolidate what ethical thinking in Indian tradition has been, mostly focused on the ancient Indian tradition. Now let's start with, we'll briefly go over a few views and understand how they have been dealt with. The Vedic view, classically what we've heard about the Vedas, and Vedas have a lot of stories in them, and they talk of a lot of rituals, of practices to do, and evidently therefore the Vedic view is externalistic view of morality. It talks about Rita, or the cosmic order, that is the supreme order that is to be followed. I'll take a pause here and talk about this term called Rita. Now Rita, you notice a dot below R, and these are called diacritical marks. So whenever one writes Sanskrit terms in English language, the correct way is to use diacritical marks, and you can look out on the internet, and there are many help manuals about how to use diacritical marks with pronunciations. A good idea would be to write your own name with using diacritical marks, and that would be the most accurate way of writing an Indian sounding name in English alphabets. So Ruta is also known as the cosmic order. Now Ruta is an example of teleology. If you all remember teleology that we talked about from ethics, teleology was about purpose. Ruta says that there is a cosmic order that needs that executes itself, not that it needs to be followed, but there is a cosmic order. The universe, the cosmos, is purposive, it is teleological, and one ought to act according to that. So in this sense there is an eternal order that needs to be followed, and in the Vedic view the Rita, or the cosmic order, is supreme and it needs to be followed. All else is wrong. Right and wrong have no sanction of the inner character or motive. Sin is regarded simply as disobedience of the commands of a god. So it's quite ritualistic. The Vedic injunctions are generally ritualistic. They are focusing on your acts, they are focusing on acts. So ethical judgments are pronounced on acts. So, and these are generally associated with stories of gods and injunctions from gods which need to be followed. So, this is mostly externalistic with little consideration of inner motive or intention of the doer for judging his act to be right or wrong. So, the Vedic view we see mostly focuses on our external actions, does not pay too much heed or does pay very little heed to the inner life, the motivation, the intention of the acts. Now, let us look at the view of the Smritis. Again, Smritis here you would notice the dot put here is a diacritical mark. Smritis and Dharma Shastras here again are diacritical marks. So, these are what is a good idea, that if you would like to maintain a level of accuracy in writing Sanskrit terms in English, your proficiency on diacritical marks will make it very accurate. Now, the view of the Smritis, Dharma Shastras, these are the Shastras talking about Dharma, and here let me spend a moment on this term Dharma, which is a very deep, profound concept and which can be seen as the Sanskrit equivalent of what is morality. So, Dharma itself could mean so many things. Dharma could mean property. So, the dharma of fire is to burn. Dharma is also the right way of doing things. Dharma is definitely not religion the way religion is meant to be, but dharma is something that you ought to do in a certain circumstance. Dharma is something that is your property. Dharma can be many things, and so any discourse on dharma is essentially a discourse on ethical theory in the Indian tradition. So, the Dharma Shastras also preach externalistic ethics, where inner motive or intention of the doer, this should be of the doer, does hardly seem to constitute the rightness or wrongness of the action done by him. So, the doer's rightness, inner motive does not matter here. Dharma Shastras are against again focused on the external externalistic world. There is occasional mention of inner virtues as in intention. Remember, when we talked about virtue ethics, this was talking about the inner world, the world of character, the world of intentions. Purity of motive and intention is also necessary for doing moral acts. Only overt acts will not do. So, here we see a movement from the Vedic focus or Vedic time focus on external acts to internal acts also. Now, so there seems to be a little involvement in of motive in this particular view of the Smritis, that there is a role of intentionality, there is a role of your inner life, of purity of motive and intention as necessary for coming out to judge an ethical character of an act. Then we come to the Upanishadic view. In the Upanishadic view, inner dispositions start becoming important. So, and I quote from the text referred, I quote, "Sin is not merely failure to do the right, but failure to let good intention to act. Actions do not bind, what binds is the evil disposition." So, end quote. So, this is where in the Upanishadic view, Upanishads also as a philosophy start advocating or discussing the abstract. They move from Puranas and Vedas, which comprise more of stories and injunctions, to Upanishads, which comprise more of philosophical expositions. So, here you can see the Upanishadic view, the inner dispositions start becoming important. So, it is not about just what you act, but what is the disposition from which you act. Then we come to Nyaya and Vaisheshika view. These are also schools of philosophy. So, there are various schools of Indian philosophy, if you may or may not be aware of. So, Charuvaka is the first school of the school of Indian philosophy that is characterized sometimes separately because it is a materialist school of philosophy. There is Nyaya Vaisheshika, there is Sankhya Mimamsa, there is Vedanta, there is Jaina, there is Buddha. Of course, then there is Vedanta split into Advaita Vedanta, Ramanuja Vedanta, Vishishta Advaita. So, these are roughly schools of philosophy that you may just hear or not worry if it does not register with you, because it is beyond the profile of the course that we are doing right now. So, Nyaya Vaisheshika is another school of philosophy. For the Nyaya Vaisheshika, righteousness and unrighteousness are the qualities of the self and not the objective act which is prompted by the self. This is why it is the purity or impurity of our intentions, abhisandhi, which constitutes the rightness or wrongness of our actions. Now, we will see how much tremendous importance being paid to the notion of intentions, that intentions become crucial in determining the rightness or wrongness of action, and here intention becomes crucial to moral thinking and judgment. Now, the Mimamsika view reads out that rightness and wrongness are objective categories and they have nothing to do with subjective motives of intention. This is again a seesaw, and that is why also there you will come across the difficulty of summarizing the Indian tradition, because the Indian tradition comprises, even in the ancient Indian tradition, of schools which have been very much contrasting in their approaches to knowledge. So, look where Nyaya Vaisheshika paid so much of importance to intentionality, the Mimamsika schools are ignoring the importance of subjective notions of motives and intentions, and rather they are focusing on objective categories and looking at acts as crucial. So, even accidental acts are also culpable, intention does not matter. So, even when one unintentionally commits something, does a morally loaded act, well then one is held accountable for it. This is the Mimamsika way of looking at things. So, remember a few classes earlier when we talked of an example where there was a crowd of people near a pond where a child was almost drowning, and another curious onlooker came in to find it out and was pushed into the water, and by the way rescued the child, because it was not his volition to jump into the water and rescue the child, but he was pushed by the crowd accidentally and he did the rescue by the way. So, for a Mimamsika, that also earns credit to him even though it was not his intention to save the child. Vidhis or processes and nishedhas, that which is forbidden, are the do's and don'ts to be followed meticulously. So, for the Mimamsika view is quite ritualistic, the vidhis and nishedhas are to be followed meticulously. Then we can talk about the Bauddha and Jaina views. There is quite a bit of similarity between them. Actions are good or bad not in terms of external consequence they produce, but the inner motive which prompts them. So, again the importance of inner motive and consequences do matter. It is not just the intention that one holds, but also the consequences that come about. Now, there is each of these schools that I have mentioned is an enormous school of philosophy with a significant discussion on ethical theory, and this in no way does justice to it, but just to introduce you to the school so that you are familiar with the names and what kind of positions taken. And again the almost impossible task of summarizing what is essential to Indian thinking, because you can find Indian philosophical schools so contrasting and in fact even sometimes contradicting each other's point of view. Now, let us look at some characteristics of Indian moral system. This Shri Kedarnath Tiwari has tried to abstract as something which makes it which summarizes across these systems, and take a look at them so that you can make some sense out of it. So, the importance is given both to social and individual aspect of ethics. Sometimes it helps to contrast, to understand the Orient in light with the Occident, the East in light of the West. So, one thing that is common about Indian moral systems is that not only have they focused on the individual, but also the social. Both of them seem to deserve, seem to merit attention in the ethical framework. The outlook of most Indian moral systems is spiritual, and the spiritual goal is moksha. However, there is a school of philosophy, Charuvaka, that do not align themselves to this spiritual goal of moksha. For them, death is the end of life. So, there is a contrarian view, a contrarian school even within the school of ancient philosophy. Indian moral systems have a strong metaphysical basis. Ethics is integrated with metaphysics. For most Indian schools of philosophy, ethics is not a standalone, isolated, discrete enterprise, rather it is integrated with the metaphysics of the system at large. So, that means the kind of ontology, the kind of core metaphysical theories that the system holds will influence the kind of moral values that that system propagates. Authority is a crucial source of knowledge or moral knowledge. So, sometimes authority is taken as a crucial source of knowledge. Indian moral systems aim to be practical. It aims to create an accessible code of conduct for living life. So, it is not just mere theoretical speculation, but also it tries to bring about a practical aim to create an accessible code for common people to live their lives. And finally, the Indian moral systems are deeply humanistic, that is, they are centered around humans. They are not universalistic in that sense that they cater to some abstract idea, but they are very much keeping human beings at the center of their conceptualization. Now, with this, when we talk of ethics in the Indian tradition or in any long tradition, in any ancient tradition, how can we not talk about epics? Epics are crucial to moral theorizing, to moral thinking in any tradition, and our tradition or Indian tradition is no exception to that. Any talk of ethics cannot but include the epics. And let us take a look at this, because most of you or many of you would be familiar with the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. Many of you would be familiar with different epics of different cultures. So, we will just take a look, prepare the ground for how to use the epics, or how epics have contributed to moral thinking in various traditions. So, this is a more general understanding of epics, which can which we see that can help moral theorizing take place in various traditions, typically now in the Indian tradition. Let me read out from the screen. The epics are a fertile conceptual resource for extracting and exacting philosophical perspectives that may provide a more grounded and rooted introduction to ethical problems. The epic's route to moral philosophizing is not only a potent philosophical discourse, but also a discourse that is rooted in context and makes for a very engaging and profound philosophical exercise even in the domain of ethics. The epics are definitely our cultural heritage and have influence in more ways than apparent. So, the epics are stories, right? What are they doing? They are extracting and exacting philosophical perspectives, moral perspectives, rendered in the form of a story, sometimes fictional, sometimes real. And as we will later see, that does not make a difference to its potency as a tool for theorizing, moral theorizing, for philosophical theorizing. So, here again, now there is another notion that I would like to introduce, so that you can start making and appreciating, in fact, rather articulating a more important sense of what is a narrative. Narrative is a word that you may have been using and hearing, but let us look at epics as narratives, taking stories seriously, right? When you watch a movie, when you watch a cinema, it is a narrative that is playing along. What is a narrative? A narrative is a story in the first person that is playing along. There is a narrative of your life, there is a narrative of a story, there is a narrative of a cinema that gives you a holistic first person inside view of life it happens. So, let us say the narrative in political philosophy for the past half a century is that democracy is one of the best forms of government. So, this is a narrative that is being manufactured, that has come into being, that sometimes is also alleged to be manufactured. Narratives are not empirically verifiable per se, but narratives are so macro, so big picture, that they seem that they are almost speculative, but they also form the dominant way of looking at the world. Let me read out what a narrative is from the Oxford Dictionary of Literary Terms. A telling of some true or fictitious event or connected sequence of events recounted by a narrator to a narratee, although there may be more than one of each. Narratives are to be distinguished from descriptions of qualities. This should be a recounted states or situations. Let me start. Narratives are to be distinguished from descriptions of qualities, states or situations, and also from dramatic enactments of events. Although a dramatic work may also include narrative speeches, a narrative will consist of a set of events recounted in a process of narration, in which the events are selected and arranged in a particular order, which is the plot. The category of narrative includes both the shortest account of events, for example, the cat sat on the mat, or a brief news item, and the longest historical or biographical diaries, travelogues, as well as novels, ballads, epics, short stories, and other fictional forms. So, if that sounds confusing, just look at or try to understand narratives as something which is a holistic picture of what is happening in the first person view, right? The narrative of a world order. So, a story that puts out a narrative. So, narratives are stories, and stories are important. Stories are serious. They are not just for entertainment, although they do entertain, but we also need to understand that things that entertain can also teach. So, all teaching does not have to be drab and boring, and all entertainment does not have to be without any learning quotient. So, narratives and epics, in my understanding, as a classic example of something which educates while it entertains. That is the power of stories, and that is the power of narratives. So, narrative is associated with the oral tradition. Now, let us look at the oral tradition. Now, if you look the history of your own family, right, your own particular family that you have is not something that has been written down in a history book, unless until you belong to one of the royal families. But for most of us commoners, our personal histories, our families' histories are transmitted through word of mouth. They are not documented in writing. Also look at the history of human civilization. Printing, writing is quite recent if you compare it with the history of humankind thinking and learning. In the Indian tradition, for a long time, knowledge was transferred verbatim. So, it was recited and memorized, and it was transferred through the oral tradition. There was no written, there was no writing for quite some time, and the oral tradition meant that things are transferred through our own, through speech, through memory, but not through writing. Let us look at how the oral tradition is defined. The passing on from one generation to another of songs, chants, proverbs, and other verbal compositions within and between non-literate cultures, or the accumulated stock of works thus transmitted by word of mouth, ballads, folk tales, and several different versions, because each performance is a fresh improvisation based around a core of narrative incidents and formulaic phrases. The state of dependence on the spoken word in oral cultures is known as orality. So, knowledge is passed from one generation to another by the means of oral tradition, by means of memory. So, if you would look at religious institutions of today also, say madrasas or gurukuls, a lot of knowledge is passed through the oral tradition. That means the students are made to recite it continuously till they have memorized it completely, and that goes on to the next generation. But now be cautious of the fact or of the easy conclusion that you think that printing and technology were the only reasons why the oral tradition prevailed, or the lack of printing technology was the only reason why the oral tradition prevailed. But is there something more in the oral tradition that is not covered by printing or not covered by documented way of transmission of knowledge? And here I'll give you a short snippet for you to think of the relation between memory and understanding, right? And this is laying the foundation of why the oral tradition has a character independent of just storing information. So, it is not that earlier there were no computers, so that is why human beings memorized and stored it, and now since there are computers, the storage part of it is done in the computers and human beings need not memorize it. The story is not that simple. And here if you look at the assumptions that the oral tradition carries, that memory and understanding have a deep relation. Now, once you have memorized a text, let us say in a Gurukul or in a madrasa or in a religious institution, once one has memorized a text, one is able to recall parts of it, arguments of it, bring it to a relate it to a current context and get an understanding of it. If one has not memorized it, the understanding you cannot pull out relevant sections of it by looking into the book or by searching it from the computer, because you would not know what is relevant. To know what is relevant is to have it in your memory and thereby have that understanding. Think over this as a justification of why the oral tradition carries meaning over and above the usual way of transmission of knowledge through printing, written documentation or electronic storage records. When one remembers something, one can recall spot the relevant section and recall it and relate it to the current context. If one has no memory of it or very little memory of it, it cannot be pulled out by the person for use in a context that has come up. Now, let us come to the question that what are the epics? Now, epics is not just a genre in literature, but a classic that has survived the test of time and is a significant perspective on the civilization. Now, this is crucial to comprehend that epics are not just stories or literature, but one thing about epics is they have survived for quite a long time. Look at classics. The classics have been read for over and over long durations in human history. Look at the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. 500 years back also people read the Mahabharata or the Ramayana. So, and 500 years is quite a recent past in the history of that text. The epics pose a question that is essentially and eternally human, a rendition of the human predicament. I repeat, the epics pose a question that is essentially and eternally human, a rendition of the human predicament, and regional or temporal retellings are only the contextual answers to these human questions. So, when we look at epics, they are, what is it that makes them last so long? What makes them last so long is because they connect to the human predicament, that generations across centuries have made sense of it, and that is the reason why the text has continued, else the text should have disappeared or become redundant or irrelevant. But because every generation is able to make make sense out of it, can relate to it, it continues. And why does it, why can people make sense out of it, why does every generation make sense out of it? Because it is a rendition of the human predicament. The human predicament as something which is classically identical across time, that is by the very nature of being. Let us say a let me give an example to flesh it out and for it to make sense to you. The joy of conquering, that human beings feel a certain joy in encountering a difficulty and conquering it. This is a rendition of the human condition, a plot of human life. In different generations, in different centuries, this is fleshed out differently, this is instantiated differently. Say 500 years back, it could have been a battle with a neighboring army. Say 10,000 years back, it could be battle with an animal predator. With currently, it could be just climbing a mountain. Maybe in the future, it could be playing an immersive video game where there are a lot of difficulties planted and one has to conquer that. So, the sense of conquest, sense of challenge and conquest is something that remains common. How it is instantiated or the particulars in which it takes place, that is what keeps changing over time. Taking from Paul Merchant, an epic is the animated history or a lived experience history of the land, a subjective phenomenological method to resurrect the past in its totality, exceeding the resurrection of dead artifacts from excavation. Now, if not to complicate this further, but just to allow you to help you to appreciate and think about the power of epics, that it is a lived experience history, right. So, epics are not just archaeological findings, epics are not and are just mere historical facts or brute facts, but rather they are how life proceeded. Let me give you an example here. Archaeology is both an art and a science. How is that so? Let us look at it. An archaeologist digs up and say finds some artifacts, right, does carbon dating, finds out in which period do they belong to. This is the science and technology part of it. But given the artifacts, given the excavations and the maps and the buildings, what kind of life was lived there, what was the story of life there, is not something that the artifacts will tell us. It is something that we have to knit and imagine, that what is the way life was led over there, and that is the arts part of the archaeological enterprise. So, to build the story, the narrative of life that took place from the artifacts that have been excavated, from the buildings, structures, maps, everything that has been excavated, they do not tell the story, you have to create the story, because there can be different stories, and this is the archaeological humanities part of archaeology, where the story is built and the most consistent story is regarded as the story of that particular civilization that has been excavated. Now, the epics are a scaffolding to understand ourselves, an interrogation to reveal the here and now, and self revelation is the precursor to any meaningful change. Now, here we are moving from ethical theories to almost metaphysical or epistemological claims, that we are looking at self revelation, that what are the epics doing? The epics are interrogating to reveal the here and now, that how to understand, to ask those questions with which we realize what our moral framework is, with what our understanding of life is. So, if these are complicated, you can ignore them, but if you are finding juice in it, you are welcome to take it further. These are not a part of the core skills required to do a course in ethics, but these are something openings that give you scope for exploring further. A civilizational interrogation to enlighten the human condition of the present, and using a part of this interrogation to think about the moral questions and the philosophizing that follows. So, when we look at say a classical story, right, an epic, let us say I can think of Vibhishan deciding in the Ramayana, Vibhishan deciding to side with Ram instead of Ravan, who happens to be his own brother. Now, that is a classic example of Vibhishan valuing justice or truth over loyalty towards kith and kin. Now, whether we find Vibhishan as a hero or an anti-hero also tells something about us. It is interrogating us. So far, us as in as a society, a civilization, even an individual, that if we have a situation where we think that no, what Vibhishan did was wrong, then the interrogation leads us to find out that, well, we value loyalty more than truth. Whereas if we think that he did the right thing, then the society or the individual is one that is holds justice or truth more important than loyalty. Because even we can you drop the use of the word justice and let's just compare it as what is right and what is loyal. Is loyalty more important than being right, or is being loyal being right? So, in that sense, a complicated or deep reading of epics will tell you that the epics are not a set of answers, rather they are a set of questions that each epoch has to answer for itself in light of the various answers, versions and retellings that have occurred earlier across time and space. Its supposed ambiguity is not its weakness but strength, the ability to connect and interrogate varied epochs. So, an epic has various regional retellings, right? The Mahabharata or the Ramayana typically in Malaysia is different, in Sri Lanka is different, even in parts of India the Ramayana has different retellings. What is the advantage and why these retellings? Is it that we need to search one authentic telling of the Ramayana? No. The claim here being made is that these regional retellings incorporate the local context and therefore make it relevant to the local situation and context. So, here is where the oral tradition incorporates context. There is a strong view that epics are carried by the oral tradition and hence inexact. That means a question that perhaps bothers many of us and particularly younger people, that, well, did the Ramayana or did the Mahabharata or did any particular epics actually take place? Is it historical or is it fictional? The answer here is it does not matter whether it is historical or fictional. It being factual does not add to its credibility, or its being imaginary or fictional does not take away anything from its credibility, because the purpose of it is not a historical documentation, but an interrogation of a society to help a society to arrive at a moral compass. So, the oral tradition, let me read it out, oral tradition can be a strength rather than weakness, for the oral tradition keeps the text alive to the context. The oral tradition incorporates the context. So, when a few moments earlier we were talking about what is special about oral tradition, did the oral tradition, was it just waiting for technology to take over and bring a smoother, more effective, error proof way of transmitting knowledge? No. The oral tradition also has its own way of own character. So, when the oral tradition transmits knowledge, it keeps the text alive to the context. That means, if you look at new movies that are being made, say I can think now immediately of Bahubali, a movie that has you can see quite thematically represents a lot from the epics. To bring it out as a classic battle between good and evil, of loyalty, of betrayal. So, these are the plots that come across, and a regional retelling incorporating contexts These are all the power of oral tradition that a written tradition is fixed and rigid, does not allow for it. As Skinner etc. put it in Mohanty, that is J. N. Mohanty's book, this one, the idea of the truth about the past uncontaminated by present perspective and concerns is a romantic ideal of purity which has no relations to any actual enquiry. So, this whole notion of purity, the exactness, is perhaps the wrong thing we are looking for, and that is what Skinner has argued here, that the idea of a truth about the past uncontaminated by present perspectives is frivolous, because the past is fleshed out in the vocabulary of the present. So, if we are thinking there a pure representation of the past independent of the context of the present, we are perhaps in a misguided enterprise. That is the claim, and that is the power of oral tradition, because the oral tradition continuously incorporates the context. So, the text is alive in that sense, because it is growing. If it were just a printed text or a codified text, it would be dead, because there is no scope for a change, right. So, the idea of India as a nation cannot be comprehensively explicated without referring to the various epics that constitute the nation, and this is true for any nation, any civilization, any culture. To understand them, to understand the idea of a nation, one has to look into its epics that precede it. As Professor A. Raghuram Raju points out, in contrast, the constituents of Indian nation are family, region, bhasha, the past, and so on. Hence, to understand the nation in India, unlike a nation in the West, it is necessary to acknowledge its contents. In sum, focusing on the constituents of the Indian nation would reveal the non-derivative aspects of the Indian nationalism. So, to understand India as an idea, ethical theories in India, and before that, to understand India, one needs to look at so many constituents that go up to making a nation. Now, in conclusion, the epics serve as rich stimuli for any civilization to interrogate itself and to attain a clarity on itself that is possible only in the big picture that can be painted with the epics. The facticity or historicity of the epics has little to do with its significance. It is a civilizational rendition, a story of the human condition, not the laying out of historical facts. The profoundness of the epics can be tapped to bring out moral philosophizing, which is conceptually rich and contextually connected. So, ethics in Indian tradition, if we ought to look at it, and in fact in any tradition, we ought to look at the epics, because the epics are what bring out the moral philosophizing of the tradition. The epics is something that is both entertaining and thereby has a wider reach, and yet has the subtle implanted character of moral theorizing. So, when we discuss the epics, when we discuss the Ramayana, the Mahabharata, or whichever epics in whichever tradition, we are also engaging an act of moral theorizing, perhaps an act of moral thinking, which is more practical, closer to lived experience than ivory tower theorizing. With this, we come to an end of the course Moral Thinking, an introduction to values and ethics. We have had a brief introduction to various kinds of moral concepts, and I hope this has enriched your understanding of the value domain that we all come across, and it encourages you to identify value problems, to understand value problems, and to make moral or value arguments. Thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you do well. Thank you.